Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be building a really simple URL shortener using Python and Flask. So let's start off with what exactly a URL shortener is. So let's take a quick example. I'm over here at my YouTube page, and this link over here is pretty big. So you have /channel and a ton of letters, right? So instead, what the URL shortener is going to do, it's instead of having such a long link, it's going to shorten it. So how does that look like? So over here, I'm going to copy this over here. And this is the URL shortener that I created. And you can find the link to it down in the description below. And one more thing, just to note that since I hosted it for free, it only can accept up to 20 users at a time. All right, anyway, so I'm going to paste this URL over here and hit submit. And what this is going to do is going to give me a shortened version of our URL. So this over here, all it is, it's basically the same URL as the URL that we're on, tinyurl anish.herokuapp.com. And at the ending of it, it has a code. So this code is going to be a 3-letter alphabetical code. And that code is going to represent one of our URLs. So when I copy this, it should take me to the same page over here. So this is the page I'm currently on. Let's open a new tab, paste this link and enter. And as you can see, it redirects us to the exact same page of my YouTube channel, right? So this is exactly what we're going to do. And just to show you, I created one more method. So it's called all_URLs. So if you hit that, so this shows us all of the URLs. So for example, this over here takes us to the Bootstrap document. And instead of typing this whole thing over here, we can just take this short code, which is capital V, capital G, and small g, and put it at the ending of our URL, hit enter, and it's going to redirect us to the Bootstrap document. So that's all that we're going to do. And all the material for this project is going to be down in the description below. And you don't really need to know too much about Flask. As long as you have a basic understanding of Python, this should be pretty simple. All right, so before we start off with the code part of this question, let's kind of understand how this is going to work so we know how we can approach this question. So over here, we're going to have two different cases. So in one case, our user could send us a long URL. So he would send us a long URL and we would send back a shortened version of the URL. So given a long URL, we're going to send back a short URL. So that's one condition. And the second condition is when the user gives us one of the short URLs, right? And what we want to do with the short URL is redirect them to the long URL, which that short URL corresponds to. So let's see how this works case by case. So let's go on to our first condition. So our user over here is going to send us a long URL. Okay, so now what's going to happen is we're going to go to our database, and all our database is going to do is going to hold the values of the short URLs and the long URLs. Okay, so over here, we're going to get a long URL and we're going to check for one thing. So first we're going to check, does the long URL already exist? And if it already exists, we're just going to give the shortened version of it back to the user. But if the short version does not exist, we need to create a new code. So there's several different ways how one might create this code. But for our purpose, let's just make it really simple. And we're going to pick 3 random letters. And we're going to check if those 3 random letters were already used. If those 3 random letters were not already used, then in that case, that is going to be our new shortened code. So let's just call it XYZ. And XYZ is going to correspond to whatever the long URL the user gave us. So now we have a certain long URL stored inside of our database. And one more thing, we're going to return this back to our user. Okay, so now let's go on to our second condition. So now let's say the user, given XYZ, they want to get redirected to whatever URL that represents. So now our user is going to pass XYZ, right? So that's the code which corresponds to the short URL. That's going to go to our database. And in our database, we're going to search if anything in the short list has that code. And we do have one of the codes. So XYZ exists right over here. And since this exists, we're going to go to its long URL. So this is a long URL of X, Y, and Z. And we're going to redirect the user to this over here. So we're going to send this over here and redirect the user to whatever page the long URL represents. So that's how we're going to be using this. And now let's see how we can set up our application, and let's see how this works real quickly. Alright, so for this project, we're going to be needing a few libraries, and one more thing, I would recommend using a virtual environment if you know how to set that up. Okay, that being said, we're going to install Flask, so F-L-A-S-K, and F should be capital, and we're also going to be installing something called Flask SQL Alchemy, and all that does, it helps us manage our database, and you'll see how much of a useful tool it is. So Flask, and then dash, and then SQL is going to be all capital, and then Alchemy, A-L-C-H-E-M-Y. And one more thing, A should also be capitalized in Alchemy. Okay, so we have this, and it should install it for us. Okay, so I already have everything, so it says requirement already satisfied. Okay, so now that we have this, let's look at how our project is going to be structured. Okay, so over here, I have our folder called URL Shortener, and inside of this folder, we're going to have all of our code and all of that stuff. So over here, I'm going to create a new file, so Python file, and we're going to call this file app.py. So this is going to be the file which runs our main app. And one more thing we want to create once we're over here. So we'll go and we'll create a directory or a folder. And this directory over here is going to be called templates. And the name has to be the same. It has to be called templates, T-E-M-P-L-A-T-E-S. And inside of this, we're going to have all of our HTML, which we're going to be using in order to display for our Flask application. So let's start off by creating our very basic Flask application just to see if everything is working, and let's see how that looks like. So this is how our Flask app is going to look like really basically, right? So in the beginning, we're going to end up importing Flask, and we're going to initialize our Flask app. So after that, we have a decorator function over here. And if you don't know what a decorator is, all it is, think of it as a super function which wraps around the functions inside of it. So in this case, this decorator wraps around this function. And all this decorator is saying is app.route. And what that tells us is when we go to whatever the URL is, and when we go to slash, that is going to end up returning whatever this is. So we're going to end up returning hello world. But if at the ending of our URL, we go to /Anish, then in that case, it's going to end up returning hi Anish. And what this over here stands for, if name equals to main, so that means if we're running the current file that we are on, it's going to run our application over here. By default, Flask runs on port 5000, but we're just going to specify it. And one more thing we want to do is we want to set debug is equal to true. And all that gives us, it gives us a ton of extra information, which really helps us with finding out when we have certain problems. Okay, so I'm going to run this over here. So when I run it, you could see that we're currently running on this over here. So we have 127.0.0.1, and what that means, that corresponds to the current laptop or whatever computer you're using right now. And semicolon 5000, what that means is that we're going to port 5000. And if for some reason it's not working, you can change the port number to anything else. And usually the higher values are not being used. Okay, so we're going to open this up over here. And as you can see, so by default, every application goes to, so this is the same as typing our URL over here and doing slash and click enter, and this takes us over here. So that is our home page. So now let's go to our other method, which is /Anish. So let's go to /Anish over here. And as you can see, once I go to /Anish, it's going to change and it's going to say hi Anish, since that's what's over here. All right, so now that we have this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some HTML files and see how we can use that in order to display certain stuff. All right, so over here, we have our templates folder. Now inside of our templates folder, we're going to be putting all of the HTML needed for our project, right? So this is where we put all the HTML. So in Flask, we have a really nice option of using something called as a base template. So what does this actually mean? So let's say that you're browsing through Instagram or Reddit, and if you look at any of those sites, as you're scrolling down or something, most of the site stays the same. The only thing that's changing are the specific posts or something like that, right? But the whole site itself isn't changing. So that's what we're going to use and implement in the base HTML file over here. So this is how using a base template can be really important. So this is what we're going to do over here. And if you don't understand what that is, it should be really clear soon. So this is going to be our base HTML template. So what I have is I added Bootstrap to it. And if you don't know what Bootstrap is, Think of it as it's a CSS library which has a ton of predefined rules and code written for us, which we can directly just use. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but yeah. So this is how our base.html looks like. It's a normal HTML page, but the only difference you see over here is, let's go to our title block over here. Now the title block is not going to be same for each of the pages that we go to. So what we're going to do is, instead of writing this title block each and every time inside of our new HTML page, we're going to give a block title and then we're going to end the block over here. So what this lets us do is we can directly just access the certain block and only change the elements that go inside of this block instead of rewriting everything. So another example is, as we have over here, we have our body. And what does this mean? So we put everything inside of a div. The only reason for that is so that everything looks a lot better. But over here, we have the words Anish's URL shortener, and we have a horizontal rule going by it. And below that, we have a block content and an end block. So what this is telling us is these two lines of code are going to be in all of our web pages. So if you look at the previous tutorial or demonstration that I showed you, all of my web pages had these two lines of code. And the only difference that is going to be whatever goes over here. So instead of rewriting all of this, rewriting all the bootstrap stuff, we can just directly write whatever goes in over here, since all of this part stays the same. So it might not be as useful for a smaller project like this, but it has a lot of application once you go on to bigger projects. So this is going to be our base template. So now how do we extend our template and use the information from this? So in order to do that, I created a new file over here called home.html, and this HTML file over here is going to be displayed at our home page. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So first we're going to extend from base.html. So that is telling our program that this over here is the base. So basically we have all of this code already in our home.html. So over here, we're going to have the block title. So block title refers to this block, since this block was called block title. So we go to block title and we're giving it a title of shortened URL. So that is going to be the new title. So instead of rewriting all of this, we just changed whatever goes over here. Okay, now let's just go into one more part. So over here, we had one more block content. So that's called block content. So we do block content, and everything over here is the same as just writing it over here. So over here, we have a form tag, and inside of this form tag, we have two different inputs, right? So over here, we have one input, and what this label is doing is just labeling out whatever. So in this case, enter an HTTPS URL. Okay, so that's all it's doing. The label is just a name. It doesn't really mean much. But what we want to focus on is this over here and this over here. So over here, we have an input value. So this input value over here is going to take a type URL. So let's say we just give it something like Anish, which is obviously not a URL. And when you hit submit, it's going to say, please enter a URL. So that HTML does that for us. We're going to give it a name. I just call it NM. And we're going to be referring to this name later on. So make sure whatever you name it, you remember what it's called. We gave it an ID, then placeholder. So placeholder is just going to be, if I don't type anything here, you could see that that's the placeholder. The size and the pattern, so it has to be in this pattern, and so on and so forth. All right, so over here we have our other element. So this is going to have a type of submit. So all it is going to be a button of a submit button, right? So this class over here, just ignore it. All this class is doing, it's referring to our bootstrap that we defined, and all it's going to do, it's just going to make it look better. That's the reason why it looks like this, and it has that small hover animation. Okay, so that being said, what does value stand for? So value is just the name of our button. So let's just say no, and let's just refresh this. Our button now has the name no. So that's going to be it for our button. So now we want to kind of link all of this back to our program. And quickly, let's just see how that looks like. So over here, we have the same thing, but instead app.route, one more thing we had to import from Flask was render template. So we imported render template from Flask. And over here, instead of just returning a plain string of characters like this one over here, we returned render template, and then we gave it the location or the name of the file that we want to display. So in this case, we want to display home.html. So that's the file that it's going to end up displaying for us. And that is why it's really important that you call the directory all your HTML files are in as templates. Okay, so this is going to directly go there, get the file, and currently I'm running this, and if you go to the home page, which is slash, it takes us to this page over here, which is exactly what we're looking for. So I just cleaned up the code a little bit, and over here we have our Python app. And one more thing you want to notice is that we actually imported a request from Flask, and all request is going to do is it is going to help us to get the information from over here. Okay, so before we get through that, so we have two methods over here. So until now, all the methods that we were doing were by default get methods. So over here, we want to define the two methods, which are post and get. So what does this actually mean? What is a post method and what is a get method? So post and get methods are both different ways to transfer data using HTML inside of a web browser. But the only difference between a get method and a post method is the fact that a post method is a lot more secure when compared to a get method. So in other words, usually in a get method, you'll be able to see the information on the URL over here. But for a post method, you will not be able to see that. So for example, earlier when we had our anish method, so slash anish, and that would give us a web page, that was a get method. But in this case, a post method will be the fact that, let's say we just paste some sort of URL. So I pasted the YouTube URL. And when we submit this, this is going to be a post method. So the data is getting transferred, but you won't be able to see it over here, right? So this over here is a post method. And let's just see what we're doing over here. So we're going to go to our home page over here. And in our home page, we're going to check what method are we using. So to get that, we can use request.method. And we have two methods, post and get. So if this is equal to a post method, then in that case, that means that we have gotten some sort of URL from over here, and we can use that for further processing. So how do we get that URL? So I've stored this in a variable called URL received, and we're going to do request.form since we're getting it from a form. And over here, we're going to give the name of that element that we want. And recalling, once you go back over here, the name of this input value over here is nm. So whatever you call it, you want to put that over here. So for me, I just called it nm, so that's what I gave it. And that is going to get whatever information we put over here. And what I did is I just made it return that just so we can see if it's working or not. So over here, I gave it youtube.com. So I'm going to hit submit. And as you can see, it just returned that value to us. So let's just take one more example. So let's just say I put this, whatever that is, and it just returned that back to me. Okay, so that's all that we're doing over here. We're taking some sort of URL and then we're returning it back to us. But if it is not a post method, all that we're going to do is we're going to display the home.html page until we actually submit something. And now what I want to do is I want to introduce the idea of a database and how we can actually use it. All right, so there's quite a bit of code, and let's just go through this step by step and understand what's going on. So the database that we're using is called SQL Alchemy. So SQL Alchemy is specific to Python, and the reason that we're using it is in SQL Alchemy, you can kind of treat each of our items as a Python object. So it makes it a lot easier to interact with. And one more thing is that by using SQL Alchemy, we can do everything in Python code. So if you don't know how to write SQL queries, you don't need to worry. You can do most of it in Python code. And also the number of lines it takes to make a certain query is a lot shorter and it's a lot easier. Okay, so let's start off by we need to configure a few things to our application. So over here, we're going to have SQLite _ database _ URI. And this over here is going to hold the location of our SQLite database. So this over here is, we're going to call our database urls.db. Okay, so urls.db is going to be the name of it, and you can call it whatever. Okay, and one more thing we want to do is we want to remove tracking modifications. So sometimes that throws up errors, so we can just ignore all of that, and we don't really need to track the modifications. Okay, so over here, we're going to create our database model over here, right? So that's what it's called. So first, we're going to store the SQL Alchemy object into our database variable over here. So after this is what we call a database model. So this model is basically going to help us create the database by itself. So over here, for each of our databases, there has to be some sort of way where each of the items in it is corresponding to some sort of specific ID. So this ID can be a string, a number, whatever it is, but it has to correspond to some sort of ID. This has to be true for each of our objects. So in this case, we're going to have a column called ID underscore. So db.column, that helps us create a column. This is going to be the name of our column, the type of variable stored in it. So in this case, we're going to be storing an integer. And over here, we're going to make the primary key true. So this is basically telling us that each of the objects is going to have its own ID unique to that specific object or item. Okay, so after that, we're going to create two more columns. So one of them is going to be called long, which stores the long URLs, and we're going to have short to store the short URLs. So the type is a string, and over here for short, we put a value of 3. So what that's telling us is the fact that we're never going to have more than 3 letters inside of the short column. So this is just constricting the space inside of it. Okay, and over here, we're going to have a constructor. And this constructor is going to help us make objects of the specific class. So in our constructor, we're going to be giving it two things. We're going to give it long, the long URL, and the short URL. So self.long equal to long, and self.short is equal to short. And the reason we're not giving an ID is because this ID is generated for us by SQL Alchemy by itself. So this over here creates our model for our database. So we're going to see how we can interact with this, and before that we want to create our database. So over here we have it over here. So all it does is before we make any sort of request, we're going to run this function. So this over here is db.create_all, and it's going to create all of the columns inside of our database. So let's just see how that looks like. So let's run, and as you can see, there's nothing over here so far. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the website over here, go back, and as you can see over here, we created urls.db. So we can't exactly see what's over here, but you can see that we have 3 different columns, right? So we have an ID column, we have a long column, and we have a short column. So that's created for us, and now let's see how we can make queries in order to put information in that and get information from that. So let's see how we can do that real quick. All right, so now we're going to integrate our SQL Alchemy database with our home function over here. So over here, like we saw earlier, we had 2 methods. So if it is a post method, the first thing we're going to receive the data from our form. And after we receive the data, over here, we're going to perform a query. So what a query is, think of it as some sort of request you're making to the database, and it's just going to perform those certain tasks. So over here, what is the query that we want to make? We want to look for whatever has the same URL as the URL received. So over here, we're going to call a variable called found_URL, and we're going to make a query. So what do we want to make the queries to? So our database over here is URL. So we're going to go to urls.query, and we want to filter our choices. So we're going to do filter underscore by, that helps us filter our choices. And over here, we want to check by how do we want to filter our parameters by. So over here, we're looking for, in our long column, we want to look for whatever has the same value as the URL received. So we're going to put that over here. And if it finds anything, we want to get the first value. So dot first, since we're only going to have one value anyways. So that is going to get us a found URL if there is a URL. That being said, there might not be a URL. So if there is not a URL, this value over here is going to have a value of none. So if there's not a URL, found_URL is just going to be none. Okay, so if found URL, so this means that the URL does exist. And in this case, we're just going to go to the short URL and just return whatever that short URL value is. So I just changed the code over here real quickly, but don't worry about that. So all that's happening over here, we're going to that found URL row, and we want to return the short value. So we're going to found_URL.short. So that is what we're going to end up returning. But as it is, we're just returning we're going to return it in a lot better way, which just looks a little bit better. Okay, so now we have the else. So over here, our long URL does not exist. So we need to create our own short URL. So over here, we're going to have short URL, and we have a function called shorten URL. So for now, I just made this function just return ABC, but we're going to make a better function as soon as we're done with this. Okay, so over here, we're going to create our new URL object. So this over here is going to be an object of the URL class over here. So in order to make an object of our URL class, we needed to have two parameters. We want to give the long URL and the short URL. So over here, the long URL is going to be the same as the URL received, which we got from over here. So this over here is URL received, and the short URL is the short URL that we just came up with over here. So we're using our function. So we give it that, and now we have an object created of that. So now over here, we want to add that new URL. So to do that, we're going to go to our database, .session.add. So that is going to be used to add a new row to our database. So what is the row values that we want to add? We want to add the new underscore URL. So that's what we end up adding over here. And after we add something or delete something or make any sort of changes, we want to commit those changes. So db.session.commit, so that is going to make our changes permanent. So at the end of this, we're just going to end up returning our short URL. All right, so let's actually just create our shorten URL function over here. So before we do that, we want to import strings. So import string, and all we're going to be using that for is to get all of the letters. Okay, so we're going to import string over here, and let's see how we can make our shorten URL function. So over here, we're going to get all of the letters possible. So to do that, we have our strings library. So string.ascii underscore lowercase gives us all of the lowercase values, and we're going to add that with all of the uppercase values. So it is case sensitive, and in this case, we also have a broader range of values that we can choose from. Okay, so this is actually going to be a really basic way to get a short URL. There's a lot better ways to do this, but for this, let's just make it simple. So over here, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of a while loop. So in this while loop, we're going to first end up picking random letters. So let's just call this variable rand letters. And using the random library, which we also need to import, so let's just import that. So import random. So after importing it, we're going to do random.choices. So from what do we want to get the choices from? We want to pick from our letters. So we're going to pick from the letters. And how many things do we want to pick? So we want to pick a total of 3 values, right? You could make it how much ever you want. So if you want it to have 10 values, you could make it 10 or so on and so forth. But let's just make it simple and just make it 3. So this is going to end up giving us 3 random letters. So these letters are going to be given to us inside of a list. So we might have A, then B, and so on and so forth, but they're going to be inside of a list. So what this does over here, it converts that into a string. So we're converting our list into a string over here using the .join method. So now we have random letters, which is a string of 3 letters. So now we're going to go to our short URL variable, and over here we're going to be making a query. So urls.query.filterby. Over here we're going to check if the short column has the same letters as random letters over here. So if the short URL has the same letters as rand underscore letters, then in that case, that means that we do not want to use this combination of letters. Since this combination of letters already exists, then since we're inside of a while true statement, we're going to go back to the beginning and perform the same steps again, come up with 3 more random variables, and we're going to do this until we come up with some sort of combination which is not already inside of our database. So once we get that, so if not short URL, so this over here is going to end up coming false. So if we do not find something which is inside, which has the same combination of letters, that means that we're going to end up with a none value. So if not a short URL, then in that case, we're just going to return the random letters since that is valid, and we're going to be outside of our while loop and we're done with the function. So that's going to be our shorten URL function. And now let's just run this to see how this actually looks. So let's run this. So over here, let's just give it a URL. So let's just give it the bootstrap document. So submit. And over here, this is the code of this certain bootstrap document. So this over here is the code, and this code is going to refer to our bootstrap document since that's the long URL that we gave it. So just to kind of confirm, what we're going to do is I'm going to give the same URL again. And since it worked, since that already exists inside of our database, we returned the short value of it, which already exists. And we did not create a new instance of it. So capital E, capital F, capital T. So no matter how many times you call it, it's going to stay the same. So now let's just give it another value. So let's just say I gave this GitHub link over here. So submit. And this gives us a new code, capital X, capital B, small u. So this code is going to refer to this over here. So as it is, this does not look really good. So let's just create a HTML template in order to display our URLs a lot better. So let's just do that real quick. All right, so over here, inside of our templates folder, we're going to create a new HTML file called shorturl.html. So this HTML file over here is going to be used to display the short URL, and all we're doing is we're just making the display look a little bit better. And you could change this and make it look a lot better, but for now, let's just make it minimal and simple. So we're going to start off by doing the same steps. We're going to extend the base template from base.html, which we defined over here. So over here, we have the title block, and we call it short URL. And over here, we have the content block. So over here, we're going to have a h1 tag. And this is going to have the URL of our app. And currently this is what it is since we're running it locally. And after that, we're going to display a short URL display. So by using double curly braces over here, what that's telling us is that we're going to insert a variable over here. So this over here doesn't have a value yet, but we are going to give it a value. Okay, so we have that. And we're also going to have an anchor tag called back to home. So when you press this, this is going to take us back to our home page, which has a path of just slash. That's our home page. Right. So now we want to connect all of this inside of our main app. So let's start off by creating this display route over here. So over here, our route is going to be /display and /angular brackets URL. So what the angular brackets mean is that whatever is over there is going to go to our function over here. So in this case, wherever those angular brackets are, we're going to get that over here to our URL. So let's just take a quick look at this. So let's just start off by running this over here. All right, so now that's running, we can open this and we have a new method called /display. And we can do slash and whatever we type. So I'm just going to type hjk. That is going to end up showing, that's going to show up, right? So we have hjk and we have the anchor tag, which when we click back to home, takes us back to home. So all it is, it's just displaying whatever, so display, and then slash, whatever you type over here is going to get displayed. It's probably not the best way to do it, but let's just make it really simple over here. Okay, so we have this over here, and we want to kind of reroute our URLs to over here in order to display that. So in order to do that, we want to import a few things. So we want to import redirect from Flask, and we also want to import URL4. Okay, so now that we're done importing them, we want to call them. So inside of our home function, back to the same thing. So over here, we actually just returned the short URL as it is, but over here, we're going to return it with the HTML file over here. So in this case, we're going to redirect. So redirect is going to redirect our homepage to whatever URL you give it. So in this case, we're going to redirect, but where are we going to redirect? So we're going to do URL4, and we want to give it the function to which we want to redirect. So in this case, that function is called display short URL, and that is the name of the display function we have over here. And as you can see, inside of this function, we have a parameter called the URL. So this URL, we want to give it that parameter. So in this case, URL is going to be equal to found_URL.short, so the short URL. Similarly, let's go to our else statement here. So in this case, we're doing the same thing, and our URL is just going to be this variable short URL, which is what we're going to end up displaying. So that's pretty much it. So let's just see how this looks like. So let's just go back to home. Let's create a new one. So we have the HTML developer docs. So let's submit. And as you can see, we have /fxn, and that's exactly what's displayed. And if you go to this, this should redirect us to the long URL, which in this case is the developer docs over here. Okay. So now we want to create that redirection. So taking this URL over here, how can we redirect to the long URL, which is over here? So that is the last and final thing that we need to do. And quickly, let's see how that looks like. So over here, we have our last path. So this is going to be /short_URL. So we're going to have a slash over here, and we're going to have some sort of value which refers to our short URL. So now remember that all of our short URLs had a small 3-letter code. So over here, you're gonna go to the URL, the base URL, and type that 3-letter code. And what that's gonna do is that 3-letter code, we're gonna look for that 3-letter code inside of our database. We're gonna find its long value, and we're gonna redirect the user to whatever that is. So let's see how that looks like. So over here, we're gonna go first try to look if that short URL actually exists. So we're gonna do that by doing a query. So query.filter by. So we're gonna look in the short column if anything is equal to our short URL. So, and we wanna get out the first instance of it. So if we actually have something in it, right? So it is not equal to none, and we actually have a value, then in that case, we're going to go to our long URL, and we want to get the long attribute of it. So calling this long URL is probably not the best name, but anyways, so over here, we're going to go to that certain row and get whatever the long URL is. So long underscore URL dot long gives us the long URL. And now what we're doing is we're directly redirecting the user to that page. So in this case, we're doing redirect, and we're going to directly take that user to that page. And notice how we're not using URL underscore for. And the purpose of URL underscore for is more to call the functions inside of our app. Okay, so that's what's going to happen if the short URL actually exists. If that does not exist, we're going to just return a h1 tag which says URL doesn't exist. You can make this displayed in a lot better way, but let's just do it like this. So let's just see how this looks like in action right now. So let's just refresh our page real quick, and now let's go over here. So let's just go to the Bootstrap doc again, submit, and notice how the URL is still the same. So now we're going to copy this, and if we paste it, it should take us to the Bootstrap document. So enter. And as you can see, it took us to the Bootstrap document. So all it did is look for EFT, capital EFT, in our database. It does exist, so it got the long URL from it, and it redirected it to that page. And just to see, to see if it's working, so we just go over here and slash, let's just give it a random value. So that over there, that is obviously not going to exist. So it ends up saying URL doesn't exist. You can make this displayed in a lot better way, but for now, let's just make it simple. And that's the main part of our application. All right, and finally, that's really it. So I would, all the code for this is going to be down in the description, and I would highly recommend that you go out and try to host this. Check out Heroku, it's a free hosting service, and it makes the whole process really simple. I'll leave down a few resources which can help you to host this, and that should be it for the video. And thanks a lot for watching, guys. Do let me know what you thought about the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe if the video helped you. Thank you.